All right. Hi, welcome everyone. We are going to have a little bit of fun today, hopefully, with some industrial accords. So the word industrial sort of encompasses everything man-made. So anything from, what we're looking at today, vinyls, rubbers. I guess technically motor oil is natural, but we're gonna lump that into something that's used in an industrial context. Also like paints, tapes, adhesives, markers, all of that stuff that we in our modern lives really do come into contact with a great deal. The big question being, how do you construct an accord for something like that? Perfumery has grown so much and began so much with materials coming from plants and animals that we have a little better understanding of maybe what's involved in creating a floral accord or a leafy accord, something like that. So when it comes to constructing an industrial accord, honestly, it's not really that different from the process I use for any of my projects. I start with trying to get very specific about what it is I want to create. So that includes, what the odor is, what the context of the odor is, and how it's going to be used. So today I pulled together 3 accords that kind of had different goals in mind. So for the vinyl pool toy, there was an aspect of it, that was the smell of the blow up inflatable. I don't know what I had in mind here. It was a while back. Maybe it was a dolphin, maybe it was a sprinkled donut, maybe it was a unicorn. But to me, that matters, even if I can't remember exactly what I had in mind at the time. So it's part the actual object, but it's part the context, right? So for me, the vinyl pool toy was about being a little kid, slathered in sunscreen, jumping onto the pool float, it being hot, the pool being cold, the squeaky sound it makes when you hit it, all of that, all of the feelings around that, all of the other kind of, and please go ahead and dip the last step of that accord. So for me, this accord is really sort of part imitation, right, or reconstruction of that actual vinyl note, and part fantasy, and having very much to do with a story or a context. And of course, accords are works in progress, It's where you begin or can begin. For me, every time I come back and teach a class on an accord and share a formula, I go, wouldn't it be interesting if I did this or changed that? I changed this accord from the last time that I taught this class. I had used a lot more manzanate and it was just kind of overwhelming. But so for a vinyl pool toy, right, we have imitation and context story. For the black rubber accord, right, this was more about end use. So I sort of saw this as the beginning inspiration for a fine fragrance, right? With the vinyl pool toy, it was just a scent to exist. I didn't really have in mind how it was going to be used. If it was it going to be a candle, was it going to be a room diffuser, was it going to go on the skin? But with a black rubber accord, I wanted to sort of approach it from a fine fragrance standpoint, right? So looking for notes that were about black rubber, but seating them in the context of things that would be wearable, So we begin with some citrus, we have some woody ambers in the dry down. So thinking about how something's going to be used, you don't have to know that from the get-go, but sometimes it can really, really inform your choices in terms of the materials you choose and how you sort of go about approaching it. For me, the motor oil accord was a straight reconstruction, right? I had a little vial of motor oil I got out of the garage and I sat and I smelled it and I did my best to try to pull materials, right, that described each of the facets I found. So that's sort of the process for me. What is the idea? What is the concept? Get clear on the vision. And for me, sometimes I use story or images or songs, right? Anything that can kind of give you reference. If you've ever taken a drawing class, you know that having a model, right, or drawing from life is much easier than trying to draw just from your imagination, especially as you're just beginning to learn how to the skills you need to draw. So for me, having a reference point, whether it's something physical that I'm actually comparing the scent with, or this very, very solid concept that I can describe, through lots of maybe different sensorial avenues, helps me come back, right? Because as you go through, you have your concept, you pull materials that you think can describe the different aspects of what you're looking for. And then you start, proportioning stuff. And you have so many unlimited options, right? We have so many materials to choose from. We have so many proportions to work with that having clarity, right, and having something to go back and reference is really how I managed to sort of, work through all of those choices. Otherwise, it's just very overwhelming. So we have a nice small class today, guys. If you have questions, feel free to unmute if you can. Chat with me, chat with us. Of course, I do have my eye on the chat, so if that's better for you, I'll try to stay up on that as well. But any questions just sort of about this general approach? No? All right. Let's get into looking at the accords. So for the vinyl pool toy accord, you guys have dipped that strip. Let's look at the individual materials. So let's begin with Styrax. So one of the things that I think is indispensable is getting to know your individual materials. And that takes a lot of time. It takes time simply to evaluate, right? Because they change over the course of time and they dissipate. So getting to know how long they last and if they shift over the course of their lifetime. But within each material is sort of a world of complexity. Of course, some are a little bit more straightforward. Others really have a lot of different pieces and impressions. And of course, this is also very subjective based on our experience. So let's start with that Styrax. Depending on what material you have and where you sourced it from, Styrax may be very, very different. So I did have a recommendation for a specific Styrax from Perfumer's Apprentice because of the 3 other samples I had from Perfumer's Apprentice, some from Perfumer's Apprentice, some from Eden Botanicals. This one had the highest presence of a particular note that I was looking for. So if you guys don't have the one that I recommended, your experience might be a little bit different. But for me, the first thing I smell here is this very high, kind of vaporous note it is a little bit sweet, but it reminds me very much of, using lighter fluid to get a charcoal grill going. And for me, that kind of vaporous, sharp quality, which comes from this styrene note, is very close to the smell of that vinyl toy, especially when it's fresh, like when you've just taken it out of the box. right? But this is a natural material. It comes from the sap of a tree. It's a balsamic material. And there's a lot of other stuff going on. So when you're choosing materials, you have to be aware that if there's an aspect that you're like, ooh, that will really work for me, you have to be sure that everything else that comes along with it will also be useful, because you're not going to be very successful covering anything up. And so this is where getting to know the spectrum of materials is really helpful. So balsamic, generally speaking, indicates some combination of kind of spicy and gourmand. Often it's cinnamic and vanillic together, but there's a lot of different balsamic materials. But that sort of combination of spicy and sweet. So I get that styrene note, and I get then some very animalic tones. I get things that smell chrysolic, and we're gonna use some paracrysol with our motor oil accord, and notes that smell like castoreum for me. So these are combinations of sort of smoky, sweet, spicy, animal, right? The animal is sort of dirty, funky, depends on which material. The crysols have sort of plasticky and waxy tones for me, right? And to me, that feels kind of like the stretchiness, right, of the toy, the way you can sort of squeeze it, but it bounces back, right? So things like that, those textural aspects, that can all play a part. We have some smokiness here, kind of a phenolic medicinal note. So smoky, but also with these things that remind me of medical settings. So like the odor of iodine, the odor of a Band-Aid, right? That sort of adhesive bandage note. And as it dries down, right, it moves more towards what we consider a more typical balsamic. You get more of that vanillic, cinnamic quality. And it gets texturally more powdery and like coumarinic. So coumarin's another note. It smells very much of sweet almond oil or marzipan. And there's a little bit of a floral, white floral freshness here from you as well. Just a trace. Right. And so we have these descriptors, right, which may be very subjective, but then we have kind of these personal associations. So for me, lighting the gas grill. I also, as a kid, in my parents' bar, they had these plastic swizzle sticks. And I swear to God, my parents were great. And I don't know how I got my hands on a lighter. I mean, it was the late 70s and 80s. It would just, child rearing was different. But I used to like to burn these plastic swizzle sticks, right? Because they'd get malleable and then I could stick them together and like build little like Tinker Toy situation. But the smell of that off-gassing of the plastic, I get that very much here as well. So for me, right, looking hard to find those styrene vinyl notes. I definitely have them here in this sample. And then those other sort of sweet tones to me take me to feelings of childhood, right? Things we love as kids. The smell of the sunscreens that were sweet and pineapple-y, coconutty, all that kind of stuff. Memories even of, the snacks that you would have after you played around in the pool and got super, super hungry, all the nice sugary snacks. And, the sort of whimsicalness of pool toys, right? So for me, that the sweetness, that gourmand aspect, that has a place for me, right? If it didn't, if this was supposed to be something representing something very like cold and calculated and sterile, then that piece maybe wouldn't really be advantageous. So really getting to know that material and knowing that you can embrace it fully, quite important. So next, let's smell amyl salicylate. So the other interesting thing that I think we'll note is that sometimes natural materials have very industrial odors. So it's not just the synthetics that we're looking towards to give us these man-made, even though the synthetics are at least processed. They're not necessarily man-made, but they are processed, down to a single molecule. So amyl salicylate, also a balsamic note, right? But a synthetic. Opens up ever so slightly minty, cool, fresh for me. And so that's nice. That's a nice lift. And then sort of that more familiar balsamic tone, you get some of that vanillic, cinnamic business happening here. And we don't have time to sit with each of these materials today, unfortunately, and really observe them and experience them. But as this begins to dry down, the salicylate texture starts to come through for me. So you'll find salicylates in a lot of different categories, in the green notes, in the floral notes. You'll see cis-3-hexanyl salicylate and benzyl salicylate. They have something in common, though, which for me is a texture that is both oily and gritty, and also happens to smell very much like old sunscreen. So when I was growing up, salicylates, not necessarily amyl salicylate, but salicylates were used in sunscreen as part of the SPF. And then the fragrances that were put into sunscreens often used these fragrance salicylate notes. So to me, it takes me to being by the beach. The texture, though, is having that oily sunscreen on your skin and rolling around in some nice, fine powdered sand. And that feeling of trying to brush the sand out, off your skin, but it's quite sticky. So you get this kind of like gentle, nice exfoliating sensation. So it's sort of oily and granular at the same time. So for me, right, it actually smells like my experience of sunscreen. So this was like an easy go-to for part of this picture that I'm trying to detail. And then you can think about approaching building your profiles through similarity and through contrast. So if you haven't read Jean-Claude Ellen's tiny but fantastic book called The Alchemy of Scent, definitely recommend that. And he really talks about this. When you build through similarity, meaning your materials have some profiles in common, right? They kind of layer up and you get richness and complexity around that profile. Those materials also seem to kind of link together. So, if you have an extra piece on one of the materials, it helps kind of merge them, right? Sort of a familial relationship. Working through contrast, you take two materials that have, nothing in common and put them together. A lot of times here you get some very interesting illusions, right? It can be a little more challenging to seat those materials together. Whereas when you're working through familiarity, I find a lot of different proportions will be, kind of fantastic. But those are some interesting ways to think about detailing your fragrance. And it's not like, oh, this fragrance is only built through contrast or only through similarity, although that's a fun kind of project to do. but simply thinking about how your materials are coming together. So here we're layering up on that balsamic tone, adding in that sunscreen note. The Sterex has the vinyl note. So for me, we're kind of a lot of the way there. And if you just take those two materials and smell them together, I kind of start to already get the feeling that I'm going for. So next, let's smell violetine. This is a violet note. Ooh, that's an old solution that needs to be thrown away. Oh yeah. When you put materials in alcohol, they oxidize over time and they get this very funky kind of vinegary note when they're too old. So that'll pass off for in a minute for me. Hopefully you guys are working with fresh solutions. So rule of thumb is a year you need to recharge your solutions. So there's a lot of fruitiness happening for me here. I get banana, pineapple, melon, some vegetal business, green, cucumbery, some of the metallic qualities of bell pepper, some overlap with galbanum. Compared to other materials in this group, like non-addianal or methyl octocarbonate, this one has a very kind of soft, powdery, waxy incarnation. So for me, the fruitiness, right, part of that, describing that elation, part of the smells of the sunscreen and the fruit salad waiting for you when you jump out of the pool for a minute. But there's like almost a chewiness, a rubbery quality, something bouncy in the texture for me here. And again, that's going back to that feel of the toy. Right, and adding this nice fruitiness in that kind of completes the scene. Next, let's smell terpineol or terpineol alpha. This is a floral note. It's funny. For me, this is challenging because this is connected to a very, very deep childhood memory. A lot of childhood business happening today. So for me, this is the smell of fear. This was the smell. This is what was used to fragrance the cleaning fluid that my elementary school was like, that they used in like the mop solution. And so when you arrived in the morning, this is what the school smelled like. And so for me, it's like I'm remembering kindergarten and like not wanting my mom to leave and being pretty scared. And this was the smell, and it's so deeply connected. It's taken me 15 years to be able to kind of smell this note and be like, oh yeah, I remember that, and not actually kind of be transported there. Right, but you can feel, especially compared to the amyl salicylate and the stearix, this is a much more volatile, sort of bright, light note. It is terpenic, right? So terpenic meaning the sort of fresh terpenes that you find generally in wood. So turpentine oil is a great example. If you're looking at molecules, alpha and beta pinene, very terpenic, and you find those pinene molecules in, pine trees and a lot of other wood notes. So very fresh for me. And I have those associations with chlorine, bleach, ammonia a little bit too. It strikes me as cool. Right, floral. It has floral freshness, and you will find this molecule actually pretty prevalent in certain flowers. So lilac, which overall is like very sweet and spicy and powdery, is full of terpineol. And that's what sort of gives it its freshness. Also linden blossom or lime blossom, super, I smell so much terpineol in that. Oh, Sydney, you have the same scent memory. That's crazy. I love that. The floralcy, though, feels kind of abrasive and powdery. So it reminds me of using one of those, abrasive cleansers as well, like depending on where you come from. For us, the brands are, Ajax and Comet, but like things you use to like scrub out your sink or your pots, that sort of granular texture. So for me, the amyl salicylate had this really nice, gentle feeling. This one, it's like rough and grainy and scratchy in my nose. And then I get these kind of earthy associations like raw mushrooms and potting soil. And as it dries down a little bit more, it gets kind of animalic, like it gets very uric. And it reminds me very much of the smell of like the stale urine in a New York subway. And so the other flower that this is really apparent in, which I don't know is very common elsewhere, but is all over Los Angeles, is the jacaranda tree, which has these purple blossoms. And they smell highly of terpineol. And when the blossoms fall and start to decompose a little, they really smell like stale urine. And people talk about how pretty they are, because they're beautiful. But whenever I walk over all the droppings of the petals, it's like, oh, hi, nasty part of New York. So for me, right, we're talking about a pool, right? The toy in the chlorinated pool. So for me, this kind of takes me, I pulled it for that facet. And when I was a kid, pools were really chlorinated, like, burn your eyes and make you cry chlorinated. So that sort of abrasive quality works really well for me here. Okay, next, diphenyl oxide. Oddly, this is a rosy note, kind of hard to see that it belongs in that family. We're going to smell rose oxide later, which for me makes a little bit more sense, or is it just a little more recognizable? But to me, if I didn't, if I wasn't sort of taught that this belonged in the rosy note, for me, this opens up really metallic. Kind of smells like tarnished brass. Right, really vaporous, really fresh. And there are some kind of vegetal qualities in there. Makes me think of peppers, the metallic aspect of peppers. But all of this sharp vaporousness, right? To me, the smell is very industrial. And when I combine this with the sort of styrene note in the Styrax, this is kind of what focusing on, again, back to really just that smell of the vinyl, this sort of has that off-gassing plastic quality. So the other thing about working through familiarity may be more technical. It may be that you want to repeat a note with different volatilities so that you get a more linear impression, right? If you want the smell of vinyl from beginning to end, but you only use diphenyl oxide for this sort of off-gassy note, it's not that long lasting, right? And so it's going to dissipate. So for me, the Styrax, although that styrene note itself passes off, because within a natural, you actually have different molecules of different volatilities. But right, we're trying to sort of create that impression over the course of time and in different ranges. So this really brings that impression up fast to the very beginning, to the top note of the fragrance. And last, we have some manzanate, circling back around to some fruitiness. So quite volatile, really fresh. Fruity like apple, fruity like pineapple. But for me, it's also very saccharine and sweet, kind of crystalline, like very sort of like hard-edged rock candy sugar version of those things. Kind of takes me to Jolly Ranchers, like an apple Jolly Rancher. Right, so there are a lot of things that smell like apple and pear and banana and pineapple, right? We have the violetine, but this one, the texture of it is quite sharp and hard. And so in addition to being like, oh yeah, those fruity notes in the sunscreen and sort of just that sense of youth that often is associated with fruit notes, you know, it feels kind of young. When you hit that, when you hit that vinyl pool toy, jumping from the side at just the right angle and get like that traction onto your skin and you hear that squeaky sound and you feel that pinch, right? For me, something about this crystalline version of this kind of takes me there, which is why I picked this one instead of something else that had a more creamy aspect or something like that. Also because this feels very candy-like, you know, again, childhood associations, but like very playful, very elated, right? Because the energy of that was like super fun and frenetic and the kind of thing that, you know, somehow children can do all day and not really get tired, right? For me, that's not such a big part of my life anymore, that feeling. So finding ways to kind of charge up the fragrance, grab your attention, keep you awake, all of those different textures and odors that kind of grab you, the terpineol kind of grabs you, too, also describes that emotional tone of what's happening. So this is a lot to be smelling very, very quickly, right? Our noses are tired. Take a break, get some little rest into the nook of your elbow there, a couple of breaths, something neutral. So normally if I was sitting down to evaluate a new raw material, or even going back to reevaluate materials, which I do all the time, right? I might smell somewhere between 2 and 6 materials over the course of 2 to 3 hours, right? And that's just to do the initial evaluation. and then coming back after 30 minutes, after an hour, after 4 hours, after 8, after 12, right? And watching and seeing how long it lasts, how it dries, how it shifts. So let's go ahead and take a look at constructing this note. We're going to look at the little formula here. Right. You guys seeing that, the vinyl pool toy formula on the screen? Yeah. Okay. So as a reminder, this is not a creative development formula. I don't go like logically with perfect proportion from one material to the next, only ever adding one material at a time. Now, it's really useful to go back and do that. So like if you've put a formula together and you just add one material at a time and you watch how those materials interact, you're going to get a lot of amazing information on what happens when you blend materials together. That if you changing a bunch of things or adding a bunch of materials at the same time, you're not necessarily sure where a particular odor is coming from, right? And it may be that you want to know how that little impression was created because it's great and you want to use it again and again. Or it may be where is that funky, weird sourness coming from, right? So going back and changing one thing at a time can be very helpful. I often will pull my palette, write some numbers down, throw everything together, just be like, okay, what's going to happen? And be like, okay, I don't really understand what's happening and where this isn't the scent I want. So maybe I'll go back and focus on a particular area, the relationship between a few materials, and then, add in a few more materials or all the materials, right? It kind of goes back and forth for me. Let's go ahead and dip step number 2. Right, so we did on the strips what step number 1 would be. Just that little combination of the salicylate and the Styrax. But let's look at what happens when we add that terpineol note. So for me, immediately you can see the difference between just base notes and adding something that terpineol is a middle note. Has a higher volatility. It comes up to your nose faster, right? And I get here kind of loose impressions, right? Of that styrene note, of sweetness, of chlorinated pool. Maybe this is enough. That's always the good question, like, when do you stop? Depending on the context, right, of how you're using this might be enough if you're using it in the context of a bigger formula and you just want, this to be a little nod to something. You don't necessarily need all the complexity. Knowing how to expand and contract your formulas is very, very helpful, right? Because at a certain point, when you take things away, you lose the character, right? Some materials you use, they're details. It's like a nice subtle addition, a layer. But somewhere in there, there's like the DNA, the structure, what it has to be in order to be its kind of most minimalist but present form of itself. So knowing where that sort of minimal area is, and then also, having the freedom to go on and detail this, like, this is sort of just floating out there as a scent, but maybe you want to expand this into a specific fragrance, right? And you'll need to maybe add more. Maybe this is fine just as it is. Who knows? So step number 3, we're going to add the violetine. So, right, this was fruity, kind of green, kind of chewy. But all of a sudden, I smell that vinyl note, that styrene note better than in the last step. So you can always compare to the last, where the terpineol is really strong, to this one. So that relationship somehow revives that vinyl note for me. And then it also starts bringing in this fruity playfulness and that bouncy, chewy texture. If I remember correctly, violetine was a late addition to this formula. I kind of had other things, and then I realized I needed something bouncier, which is why I pulled it. But it does kind of link up and help that other note come through right away. Right, and then we have our final step, adding our diphenyl oxide and manzanite are our top notes here. So that metallic aspect of the diphenyl oxide and that kind of vaporousness, helping bring up that vinyl impression for me and bring it all the way to the top. And because it's so volatile, the diphenyl oxide, I also get that feeling of like just having of the new toy where like now when I engage with stuff like that, I'm like, that's a really strong odor. Maybe I shouldn't be like so near this object until that odor passes away, because those are molecules that are literally off-gassing and flying off that we're, kind of ingesting. Right, and that crystalline fruitiness of the manzanate, those both sort of sharpen up. Right, so now I have sharp, squeaky on top of chewy, bouncy, on top of this sort of, oily, sandy, sunscreeny, salicylate texture that's going to come and be apparent much later. So you can compare this one to the strip we dipped right at the beginning of class. It's only been 45 minutes, right? So we're sort of approaching middle note territory. But you can see how it's starting to shift. Working a top note is, I think, one of the most challenging things, right? Because those notes are really intense. They come up hard and fast. And they kind of whack you in the face. So if it's not, the top note is not exactly right, we get a lot of natural desire to pull away from it. And what we need in a fragrance is for people to be willing to continue to engage with it, right? So for me, the top note, it may already be in the formula, but as I work, it's sort of like, editing a story. Maybe you begin with something a little bit more free-flowing, and then you go back and you add some structure, right? And you make different passes. And for me, the final pass those fine-tuning notes. The very, very last is the top note. Partially because if you change anything under it, it will bounce up what's above it and can kind of shockingly increase or decrease where those top notes are sitting. So always that's a final pass. And it's something you need to place a lot of attention on. When I look at fragrances, and this is something still for me, you know, continuing as a student, we're always continuing to learn. But often I see that that is one of the major areas that people need to continue to work on. You know, it's so wonderful that we have so many artisan perfumers putting their designs out into the world. Sometimes, though, that's one of the things I notice is that more attention and time should have been spent on the top note. You get a lot of really creative, fantastic ideas, but sometimes those subtle things need a little more attention. So that's accord number 1. I want to take just a minute or two. So if anybody wants to share, you have observations, impressions, what works for you here, what you're thinking you might change if you wanted to continue to work around this formula, whatever, questions, let's take a couple minutes. Don't be shy. No, nothing?
I have a question, but I don't want it to seem lazy.
No.
I only signed up for this class on Monday, so I was missing 2 materials.
Huh.
And so I used rosaline instead of diphenyl oxide and biolif instead of violetine. So, you know, normally I want to do the formula like the way it's supposed to be in terms of, you know, a class. But what, you know, when you don't have the material and then,
Right.
you know, I'm trying to like go on base notes and be like, what?
So
I
it's such a big challenge. If you've never
yeah.
smelled it, it's like we have to, that's part of the work. We have to replace materials all the time because of safety concerns, because of cost, simply because we don't have access to it. If you don't know what the thing smelled like originally, you're kind of working in the dark, right? So that is really challenging. I don't know if I've smelled either of those materials myself, so I can't really give you any advice, right? But some of the things we need to look at when we're replacing, right? There's the odor profile, there's the volatility, right? If you replace it with something that's a base note versus something that's a top note, it's going to function very differently, even if it smells very similar. And the other thing you need to think about when replacing is intensity, right? Some materials are just stronger than others. And so the amount, it may be a good replacement, but you may need to use a lot less than you used of the original material or a lot more. So really challenging, right? If you haven't ever smelled it. I don't know that there's really a way around that other than what you're doing, right? Which is researching and taking those other things into consideration and trying. The other thing, though, I always found when I started out, you know, having a perfumer share a formula was like, whoa, you know, whole worlds unfolding for you. But I often found, and I still find, because sometimes I will look at reference formulas, right? Whether they're things I've worked on before, things that were shared with me by another perfumer, demo formulas that maybe you find online, or compendiums that have formulas in them. I found a book when I was in France, the Felix Collat. It's this giant book. Le Livre du Parfumeur, it's formulas, but they're old formulas. And I was like, this is it. Now I know the secrets of fragrance, right? And I started trying to put the formulas together. And it would be like, huh, okay, but that's not the version that I want. And the same with perfumers who would share formulas with me, right? It's like, sometimes it would be like, oh, that's the most wonderful. I love that. That's totally what I'm going for. And other times it's like, oh, that's not the version, right? Which I hope is the same experience you guys have. I hope what you get from this is an idea about how to think about approaching a project, materials, or even, the facets that I would use to break down a particular profile, materials I'm choosing, right, to stand in for those facets. You can choose different materials. And then, proportions of how they come together. But my hope is, you make it your own. And that may be entirely completely different formula. It may be that note is bothersome to me, or I don't think it works well and I'm going to change it out. It may be that you're sensitive to a particular note and you find that, in my version, it's too high and you would want to bring it down, or vice versa, right? All of these things, they're jumping off points. So for me, when I look at other formulas at the beginning of a project, sometimes it's like, oh, okay, what kind of materials did people use? What families, right? This is knowing the families are very important, because you can choose within the family. If you don't have this one, you can use that one. And knowing what kind of proportions, sometimes you see some whopping dose of something, that you would only ever think to use a very small amount of. And it's like, oh, what happens there? And you put it together and you find, well, in this context, somehow that doesn't feel like too much, right? So you can kind of get all of these insights of like, oh, well, that material might be used in trace amounts, but it also might be used in really big amounts, depending on what else is around it. So hopefully this is all just kind of reference and jumping off point for you. And this, unfortunately, is the challenge of us not all being in a room together, right? Is that we're not all smelling exactly the same thing necessarily. So there's a lot of slippage. But the truth is, there always is that, because our impressions are so subjective. So I find that very liberating about fragrance, is that, what I smell in it may be different than what you smell in it, even if we're smelling exactly the same physical sample. Also, if you are working a formula and you don't have a material, I always find the best thing to do is to put it together without the material. Just leave it out. And then you can add in things and see if you feel like that's working. But sometimes you don't need it all, so it's better just to skip it. Other times it's like, oh, well, but that's, that's 50% of the formula. So probably, you're going to need to find something to stand in there. Okay, let's look at this black rubber accord. So our noses are tired. This is not really the moment to be getting to learn new materials, especially materials that are kind of subtle. My nose is tired. My nose is tired. I'm sure your noses are tired. Keep in mind, like, if you get discomfort, burning in your nose, headache, upset stomach, anything like that, that is your body very specifically telling you, you need to stop. We can try to power through. Our impressions are so skewed that they're not actually useful, right? And this happens like, oh, trying to smell something at the end of the day after having been working for hours already. And you're like, oh, that's great. And you come back the next day and you go, what was I thinking? I completely missed how intense that material is just because my nose was completely blown out. So you guys have this recording. If your noses are tired, stop smelling. You can come back at your leisure, at your own pace. So let's go ahead and let's do this backwards. We only have, I think, 2 steps I wanted to smell. So let's start by smelling the final step of this accord, so we can get an idea of where we're going to end up. It'd be nice if I have this in front of me. Okay, there we go. So, right, this is a fine fragrance type black rubber accord. I was inspired a bit by Bulgari Black, which is a fantastic fragrance that smells really, really distinctly of black rubber, but somehow is also very wearable. So this isn't an imitation of that, but it was just sort of, you know, inspired by, oh, you can do that in a way that feels very wearable. So here we have a very green citrusy top note, right? Which is very classic in a fragrance. We often see green citrus spice notes as top notes in fragrances. We have a floral note, right? That's comprising a lot, 40%, right? Which is filling out, giving us lift. We have some base notes going on. We've got birch tar, amyl salicylate, and ISOE super. Right, so we sort of have top, middle, base. I wouldn't say that this is a finished perfume. It's the DNA of a fine fragrance I might want to create. And that doesn't mean that fragrances have to be complex. You can put 3 notes together and have a finished fragrance. Absolutely. I mean, Geza Schoen did it with eccentric molecules. I mean, you know, bless him putting ISOE super in a bottle and saying this is a perfume, but you know, it is our engagement. There's no rule as to what a perfume needs to be. For me, looking at this, if I was going to continue though, the top note's a little aggressive. It also kind of is domineering. I would want to work around that a little bit, maybe reduce it and bring in some other notes to give that impression. A little more openness. And of course, if it's going to be on skin, you need to put it on skin, see how it wears, see how it lasts. So here in step 2, right, we have what is sort of the DNA just of the rubber note. The amyl salicylate and the ISOE super are in there exactly for if this is going to be worn on skin, where is it going to go and what's that relationship going to be? But here is just my little black rubber note. Now, because I use that petit grain, it's very green and citrusy as well. Right, but you can see when you compare those 2 steps, you add those base notes, gives volume, weight. Softens some corners. So let's look at the individual materials. We already smelled the amyl salicylate, right? We had sort of our balsamic sunscreeny note. Personally, I love that salicylate texture. Salicylates function not dissimilarly to musks, right? Where it's very, they have a deep relationship to the smell and the feel of skin. They're both very textural. They're both very volumizing, but if you use too much of musks or salicylates, they can also kind of blanket and inhibit other materials from expressing themselves. Something to keep in mind. So let's smell ISOE Super, a very, very popular molecule. It's all over the place in fragrances. This is an synthetic ambery note. This, at this point, may be very hard for you guys to smell. Ambery notes in general tend to sort of flicker in and out. Maybe you smell them for a second and then you feel like they disappear. They're very much there, but they play hide and seek with us a bit. So for me, this material also, depending on the day, sometimes I don't recognize it. Sometimes it's very ambery for me, and sometimes it's very woody for me. So ambery, probably best characterized by a material like ambroxan or cetylox, ambrox DL, not the woody ambers or what I call super ambers, like amber extreme. Those are related, but a different category. Nor limbinol, amber extreme, amber max. Those are my super ambers or woody ambers. Ambroxan and ISOE Super have this ambery note that's very hard to define. For me, it's very mineralic. It's very sparkling. Texturally, it feels in my nose like the finest grit sandpaper. So it's like almost a pleasant scratchiness, but it doesn't stay in one place. The ambers sort of hit my nose. They kind of dance around and sparkle. It's like, it's here, it's here, it's here, it's here. Takes me to an image of light bouncing off of the ocean, you know, those little glints that you get of light. And that amber character is very, for me, it's easier to describe with pictures than with individual words, right? Although it's mineralic, it's fresh, slightly sweet, you know, but I see limestone, you know, like a limestone cliff by the Mediterranean. And limestone is very chalky looking, you know, it's sort of very light stone, but embedded in it is flecks of mica, which have that little rainbow, right? So there's that sort of very gentle, powdery, chalky texture with these little glints of light. And I imagine that, you know, like this shelf of rock being washed in fresh seawater in the bright sun. So not briny, not marine, you know, not the smells of seaweed and really ocean, just fresh salt water. To me, it's also amber notes are super sexy and somehow also very related to a clean body. But so for me, when I smell ambroxan, it's like imagining fresh sweat breaking out on a very finely sculpted human form, right? It has that saline minerality and something kind of exciting, sparkling. A little sweaty. The ISOE Super, though, has this very woody facet as well, which for me sort of leans to cedar wood. And I get some kind of plasticky notes and weirdly leather. So I get this impression of opening a new box of white leather sneakers. So we find this note all over. It's not expensive. You can use a lot of it. Amber notes, the texture of amber notes are very popular right now. You know, older style fragrances, when people are like, oh, it smells old, generally have a lot of musks and ionones, very powdery going on in the base. Not to say we don't still use those materials, but like, woof, big presence. Now we like to find a lot of chicness in these amber notes. I myself love them. But depending on the day, to me, this smells like super cedary or super ambery. And sometimes I'm like, oh, is that isoe super? A little bit of a chameleon. And amber notes tend to exist kind of around the edges, right? Because they're very translucent. So if you use other materials that are a little more opaque and heavy, they sort of create, I think Mandy Aftel was the one who described amber. She was talking about ambergris as creating a halo effect around the fragrance, right? It's like this sparkle. If you have a hard time smelling the amber note, obviously now is not the time to decide whether or not you can smell this. And it does take time. Sometimes easier to smell after the strip has been sitting out for a few hours. But if you do the formula and just take out the amber note and put it in, right, and you can compare with and without, it's easier to locate that effect. But it is it can be very elusive and subtle, kind of subliminal. Okay, let's smell DMBC, which is short for dimethyl benzyl carbinol, like the mouthful. So more volatile, maybe easier to smell, maybe. This is in the fresh category. It certainly is fresh. It's also really rubbery. Right now, I smell pink pencil erasers. There are some kind of rough, fresh floral qualities here. A little bit of a green stemmy facet. Feels kind of cool. So in addition to the kind of rubber note, this also takes me to and makes me think it might be useful for creating odors like asphalt, soot, paint. But it also takes me to like black tea. And lime, jasmine. So I don't smell that in here, but I feel like this might live in there. Very important distinction. Oh, I really dig that note. All right, next let's smell our petitgrain, mandarin. So petitgrain means that it's coming from the leaves and twigs of a citrus tree. So this is an essential oil. It's steam distilled. So this is coming from mandarin branches and leaves. So I get this petitgrain odor, which is very green and leafy. Very fresh. Citrusy in the mandarin direction. And mandarins for me are juicy, but they're also very zesty and kind of metallic. And there's that black rubber note. Yeah, it's a little minty business, a little floralcy, a little spice. Reminds me a little of bay leaf, the spiciness. All right, so that's our top note. And then finally, birch tar essential oil. Rectified meaning they've removed certain molecule or molecules, generally for the purpose of safety. So we're smelling this at 0.1% in the formula, is that right? What's happening here? Yeah, 0.1. This is what we call a high intensity material. This is one of those materials that if you smell it at 10%, it's really strong, right? You may be into it. It expresses itself a little differently at 10%. It's very more animalic and beastie, meaty smelling to me. But you keep diluting it down, right? 0.1%, you would imagine that it would be subtle and faint. This is very present. This is as intense as, maybe more intense than some of the other materials we're using, right? Comparatively. So using strong notes like this and learning to dilute materials, it's very, getting to know the vanishing point. If a material is still really available at a low concentration, in my opinion and in my experience, it works better at a lower concentration. Usually when you use a higher concentration of a material like this, it starts to exhibit facets that maybe aren't as desirable. Although, there may be occasions where those are the facets you want. For me, with the birch tar, it's this very animalic, meaty odor. In addition to it being, stiflingly strong and maybe hurting your nose. Or, you may get oiliness or sharpness or something like that at a higher concentration. So it's good to dilute materials down and see where they're still very present. Woody. So very smoky for me, birch tar. But like burnt smoky. Having really, gotten to the char on the wood. Not just that gentle warming, of the wood as the log goes on the fire. And it's funny because it's sort of dry, but also wet. So I smell wet campfire ash. So this is just like if you just put out the fire and you have those very charred, ashy remnants, which is that ash has a very dry feeling, but then making it wet, it's funny for me, scent can be very contradictory in terms of how we perceive it. But I get also some like petroleum notes here, tar, petroleum. And then, if this hasn't blown your face off, it's there. I find little spicy balsamic tones, some aromatic cool notes, and that very black rubbery quality. So now our noses are tired. Right, but when you look at these materials, and if you've pulled the palette and you have your strips of the individual materials, you pick them up, smell them together, it can give you an impression of, what it's going to smell like. Of course, you have to find your amyl salicylate strip because we didn't just dip that one. Right, but also, just doing this, you can immediately pick out what's strongest. Do I feel like, I can smell the presence of all of these materials? Is something dominating? Right? If something's dominating, you can kind of bend that strip back away from your face and get a sense. And you're like, oh, that's better. Okay, you're going to know you're going to need to use a very small quantity of that material, or maybe a lower dilution to work with it. Right? So you can actually do a lot of work on getting started just like this. It's at least a good jumping off point. Okay. Three accords in one class is so much. Let's take a break. Let's meet back at the half hour, whatever time zone you guys are in. And I definitely recommend getting some fresh air if you can. And help me remember to hit record when we come back. All right, coming back, we're going to look at the motor oil accord. So this one was the reconstruction, right? Just of the material, no context, no consideration as to how it would be used, just trying to find the different components of the odor, choose materials to describe those components, and hopefully bring it together. So let's go ahead and dip the last step of the accord. Top note needs a little work. And I find with this, the odors are right, but they're not kind of fitting in the right order or level. So to me, this needs more work, if I was going to use this. It's a little bit maybe like, I'm not that familiar with music production, right? But same song, got to adjust the levels. So that may just mean changing the proportions. It may mean changing materials. It also may mean adding materials to help bridge gaps so that something's not sticking out quite so much. So for me, and we're going to go ahead and smell the materials, but the methyl laetone is the right smell, but it's like hanging out to the side for me instead of being in line with everything else. So questions about how to kind of yoke all of these materials together better kind of remain. So I kind of also love showing you guys things that are totally wrong or definitely still need work. Creating massive failures is the best way to learn. And for me, horrible perfectionist, perfumery is very liberating because I actually find joy when it's terrible. It's just like, oh, so bad. What is that? How did I do that? And it just makes me want to, it makes me very curious, it makes me want to go again. And perfume is, creating perfume is all about going again, revising trials. Some perfumers work really quickly, they're very decisive. Other perfumers are a little bit more painstaking. I think I fall into that category. And that's all kind of also reflected in the signature of your work. So let's look at this formula and smell these materials. Yeah, Noah, let's smell those materials and then we can go through, and as we do the steps, we'll talk about maybe what I would do next. Maybe you guys can talk about what you think you would do next, even better. Okay, sorry, I have so many windows open. Give me one sec. Here we go. Okay. So we see our materials. Oops, this needs to be moved over. Oftentimes, right, when I'm doing a reconstruction for, so let's say a flower for jasmine, it's much easier. There's a green note, there's a spicy note, there's a floral note, and there's an animalic note, right? Here, it's not that simple. So spending time with the motor oil, right? It's like, what aspects are there for me? First, it's very heavy. Texturally, the motor oil was like this crazy combination of heavy, oily, but also very gritty, but also extremely dusty. Sort of tickled up my nose while also like filling it full with this like heavy, oily, dark mass. So lots of feelings of like tar, petroleum, asphalt, like, when they're paving roads and they're doing hot asphalt, the sort of this dust, the smoke, that sort of granular nature with that tarry quality happening. But there was also a sweetness to it and a smokiness. And a bit of a sort of, I don't have the motor oil sample in front of me anymore, but like there's sort of like a biphase experience for me, where there are these like vaporous notes at the top, but this huge heavy weight at the bottom. So looking to sort of create the texture, the odor profile, and this feeling of these sensations, right? We talk a lot about odor, but when we get sensations, these tickles, scratches, pricks, that's the stimulation of our trigeminal nerve, right? The nerve that innervates our face. And so in addition to smelling something, certain molecules also give us a touch sensation that we process through, those feelings in our head, our sinus, our throat, our mouth. And this was very textural for me. I should have gotten my notes out so that I could kind of tell you a little bit more about the thought process for the materials. But I know I started with the animalics. So let's go ahead and jump in there. Let's start with Castoreum Absolute. So I'm using a natural Castoreum Absolute. There are bases available, so like Castoreum Givco and things like that. They don't smell exactly the same. If you are not wanting to use an animal product in your work, I do recommend getting a sample to smell so that you can know the difference. You can actually take a base, like a Givco base, and add other materials to it to be like, okay, now it smells like real Castoreum Absolute. So if I'm looking at Ashley's formula that is real Castoreum Absolute, I know I'm going to need to bring in a little more of this, little more of that to get there. So animalic notes are very interesting. People's responses to them are very interesting. Usually we're on a scale, as we always are, of attraction and repulsion. But I find that the animalic notes go very distinctly one way or the other. And it depends on the person. For me, Castoreum is really an attractive smell. Like I don't smell this and go, ugh. For sure, at higher concentrations, it's can be a little much because it's high intensity, but I find it very pleasant. I would hang out with the beavers. I would not hang out with the civet weasels. Useful, but no thank you. Not my jam. So here we have something leathery, oily, kind of woody, definitely smoky, kind of mossy, like peat moss, smoky. I get a phenolic note here, so that smoky plus those medicinal band-aids, iodine kind of thing. And part of that, right, that lives up here. The way I was talking about the motor oil being up here, but also really heavy down here. For me, that Castoreum has that structure. Like I feel part of it up here, but a lot of it down below. And this is kind of balsamic. It's spicy and sweet. I get sort of clovey, cinnamic spiciness. The sweet is very much like molasses. There's a certain sourness that feels kind of like a vinegar for me, which also is very associated to me with all the glands, right? All those glandular smells have a sort of sour, slightly sour quality to them. I also get honey, very much like beeswax, you know, which has this very mellifluous, sticky, syrupy texture, but also kind of powdery, like pollen. And there's a very boozy vanilla thing happening, like vanilla extract for me. And I get some of that styrax, styrene, toluene note here. Sometimes this also takes me to like grapes, more like dried, like raisins and prunes. Maybe Concord grape. So interesting, right? There is a relationship between Castoreum and vanilla absolute. They both contain a material, a molecule called guaiacol, which is an animalic, kind of meaty animalic, kind of sweet note. And so back in the day, for flavors like vanilla ice cream, vanilla beans are really expensive. And so they would use a tiny bit, a trace of Castoreum Absolute in vanilla ice cream to sell the real vanilla Absolute impression, right? Because vanilla is all about vanillin and ethyl vanillin, but it also has this like funky animalic tone to it that's really necessary for it to be like a complete vanilla bean odor. So for me, the castoreum is like kind of my canvas, like my base. Like I'm like, okay, this has a lot of, this like waxy oiliness and some of that biphase business happening, and the smoky, right? The motor oil is very smoky. Next, let's smell pericrazole. Oh, another animalic note. So a synthetic, not coming from an animal source. Oh, I smell horse manure. Hay and poop. Very stably. I also get that styrene toluene quality here, right? So could use this for our vinyl accord too. It's a little bit metallic in the beginning for me. And phenolic. Oh, that smoky medicinal business. As it dries down, it goes more into the barnyard, horse manure, leather, hay, woody tones. But it ends up, maybe you can pick it up now. It's hard, right? Our noses are tired, but if you try to focus on the undertone, right? It's like listening for the bass line in music of what's underneath here. I smell petroleum. Like it reminds me of like Vaseline and pancake makeup. Very waxy. So other industrial associations here, I get black Sharpies, right? Permanent markers, wet paint. My favorite though is the kindergarten crayon bucket. So not new crayons, that bucket of broken nubs where most of the paper is gone and a bunch of sweaty, grimy kid hands have like touched it over and over. And the smell of the crayon wax starts to take on this slightly rancid tone. And it just smells really dusty and waxy. Crayon bucket. Right, so that petroleum smell, that combination, right, of this thick with this powdery, dusty business, this irritating, dusty feeling. Also, like, what is petroleum? Right? It's natural. We tend to associate it so much with the chemical world, but it is of the earth. It is the decomposition of organic matter over time. So now I'm sort of speaking out of the side of my mouth here because I don't actually know that much about petroleum, but it comes from decomposition of organic matter over zillions of years. Zillions being a very scientific term. Next, let's smell indole. I do find it's interesting with natural materials, right, you can often smell the part of the plant that it came from. So things that are extracted from roots have a sort of rooty odor, a sort of cool, earthy thing going on. Things that come from seeds have a seedy smell. Flowers have a floral smell, so thinking about motor oil and like its origin in petroleum. Oh, smelling indole, very interesting. Indole is present in white florals, and it's also present like jasmine, orange blossom, and all the things that come out of that, tuberose, gardenia, all those guys. It's also the odor of all organic matter in decomposition. So whether it's plant or animal, as that material breaks down, it actually throws off indole molecules. So if you've ever had like a rat die in a wall somewhere where you're living, aspects of this might feel kind of familiar. It begins, this has a huge arc, and indole is interesting because it's not biphase. So it's not like it lives up here and it lives down here. Indole to me is an incredible vertical. So you smell it at the top, it lifts things on the top, but it also drills down and gives tremendous depth to a construction. It opens with the smell of kind of mothballs and unwashed human bodies, this sort of oily, camphoraceous naphthalene. It makes me think of like old sweaters that have been worn and worn and worn and put away in the mothballs. Maybe somebody who smoked a little bit, elements of that old cigarette smell. So it starts there. And in a few minutes, it dives into a scent that is very reminiscent of poor oral hygiene. So the smell of tooth rot, gum disease, right? If somebody needs a root canal, or if you haven't flossed in a long time and you're like, oh, I'm going to the dentist, I better catch up on that, right? The smell of the bacteria that's present in human mouths that indicates decay. It's also quite similar to a molecule called ambronol, that smell, halitosis-y smell, which you also find in ambergris, kind of an element of that. And then underneath that, we're not there yet. But what gets to me is a very oily, tarry, coal tar odor. So, I grew up around the La Brea tar pits. So there's a lot of just tar around. Coal tar in particular has a smell. I've never really been around coal tar. Maybe if you're from Pennsylvania or, some area where there's a lot of coal happening, or I don't know if you have a coal burning stove still, but it's often used too medicinally, like in certain soaps and shampoos, and that's where I know that odor from. It smells very coal tarry. And then under that is this sort of melange of uric fecal notes. So, indole has this massive odor profile. The way it functions in a fragrance is phenomenal. It will do a lot to enliven a fragrance and give depth. But again, that's sort of looking at that coal tar note. So we can pick up our 3 animalics. Ooh, we're getting short on time. We're very short on time. Was this class supposed to go longer? Or is it meant to end at 12? Oops. was supposed to be a 3-hour class. I'm going to move a little more quickly. My apologies to you guys. I actually may go over in terms of time to be able to go through this a little bit more. Of course, if you need to leave, go ahead. You'll have the recording available to you. So let's move on. Cedral acetate, a woody note, smells sort of cedary. I'm not going to spend too much time on that because it's pretty familiar. Corey, thank you. It's different in different places. Some said 3-hour. Are you guys available to stick around another hour? No. Yes. No. Okay. Well, I'm going to go through. Let's smell methyl laetone together. So this is one that's like, what does this have to do with it? Methyl laetone is a very creamy lactonic note, kind of sandalwoody, the aspect of sandalwood. I get hints of coconut here too. Woody.
What one are we on? I thought we were on, which ingredient are we on?
Methyl laetone.
Oh, okay, got confused. Thank you.
No, no worries. Thank you for clarifying. Yeah, I skipped cedral acetate because it smells cedary. And my nose is tired. We'll see what this does in the blend. But this was my last addition. And it kind of shows, right? Because it's kind of, I think it's one of the things that's not quite resolved in the accord. But it was necessary. And sometimes you don't know right off the bat all of the components that you're looking for. Start with what you do know. And then when you get the formula somewhere, and especially if you're comparing it to the target, like to the motor oil, it was like, oh, I'm missing something kind of sweet and more creamy. There was a lot of oily and waxy, but like it needed to be filled out a little bit and it needed some sweetness. And the woodiness was working well. Okay. Let's smell ambrosinide. Do a tiny dip, really strong material. This is one of those woody amber materials, or what I call a super amber. They're very high intensity. People often don't realize how strong they are because they actually burn through your olfactive capacity so fast that you don't smell it. You don't smell anything. So for me, I feel this before I smell it. It burns my sinuses and it feels sharp, like pinpricks. So there is an aspect of that ambery note I described before and that we find in ISOE Super. But instead of those little flecks of gentle sandpaper kind of dancing around, it's like gritty, sharp, pointed. It's a little bit green, leathery, metallic. A little woody cedar-like. Cool. It takes me to an image of wet metal. Next, let's smell isobutylquinoline. So this is in the green family. We have a couple different families. There's green leaves, there's green aquatic, and then there's just green. This is also a really strong material. Very singeing to the nose. Very strong. Very metallic for me. It's like green like bell pepper, green like tomato leaf. There's an oniony facet for me here. It also smells, though, leathery and animalic. And in fact, isobutylquinoline was used as a leather note in a lot of very classic leather fragrances, like a Cuir de Russie situation. So the first time I smelled this, it actually took me to certain fragrances. And last, we have rose oxide. So rose oxide, sort of similar to diphenyl oxide in that little category of rose notes. I love this smell. So this is one of those things where it's like, admittedly, I don't think this is a nice smell, but I love it. The way people love this, some people love the smell of gasoline. Fantastic. Really strong, though. So for me, this one is more rosy. I actually smell floralcy here. I also smell that metallic green bell pepper note. It's interesting because the floralcy actually reminds me more of a cyclamen note, like things that you get in Lily of the Valley, those sort of fresh florals, kind of scratchy florals. And I get a little bit of an anisic, like Anatole black licorice quality here. And weirdly, also, it takes me to strawberry hard candies. Sometimes things surprise you. All right, so those are our materials. Oh, I was bad. I didn't mark the strip I dipped. There it is. Of the final. Okay. So let's get into the formula. So we did on our little strips, right? Beginning with what I considered the base or the canvas, our animalic notes that brought in a lot of these textures that we're looking for. And then step number 3, the methylaetone. So if you had made step number 2 and you were comparing, which you can kind of do just smelling your strips if you didn't have this trial prepared. Adding the methyl laetone, it's sort of like taking, for me, the 3 ingredients, right? And instead of placing them in a bowl, it's like you finish mixing them together. It brings things together. That creaminess is sort of a binder and a connector. And the woody and the sweet are helping. I think the sweet, it's too strong. So my first thought is probably reduce the methyl laetone. It's actually a pretty strong note. Sandalwood notes in general, even if they're not high intensity, have a big effect. But in sort of yoking those materials together, we've lost a lot of the texture that was maybe in each individual one. And with the motor oil, the texture on it was so extreme. So now we need to work to add and detail that. So in step 6, we're adding our woody and ambery notes. So the ambrosinide, right? We know that's going to pack a wallop, give a lot of texture. And then a little of that smoky, burnt birch tar business, and a little extra woodiness from the cedral acetate. So this is where adding things in a particular order may or may not make sense. For me here, things kind of fell apart. I smell all these different things, but I don't really recognize it as what I'm going for. I smell the woody. I'm definitely starting to get some of that, you know, the upper over that lower. But what happens for me as I'm going through, and I don't know that this is the order that I kind of built this, but I'll focus on what I can smell, right? And sometimes I'll just get curious about a certain area and I'll go about trying to pull that in. Sometimes it does not really very recognizable though, but I know what I'm focusing on. It's like if you have a client and you show them something creative, like if you're an interior designer, and it's like, so imagine this. So you show them a picture, but you're like, but this isn't this and this isn't that. This would be green, and imagine, and people can't do that, right? They can't necessarily see what's not there. The same thing with scent. And this is where your expertise and your familiarity with materials and knowing where you're looking to get this piece. For me, I'm looking to bring in that sharp texture. I'm looking to bring in this very gritty smokiness into these other animalic notes. But this is starting to smell for me more like a campfire fragrance or something. Maybe barbecuing meat on a campfire at this moment in time. So let's go to step 7 and add that isobutylquinoline, that super green metallic note. Now I'm back to something in the world of motor oil. Smell the green too strongly. And of course, the sweetness on that methyl laetones. But in a lot of ways, adding this isobutylquinoline, this leathery green metallic, I can smell again the indole with its coal tarry funkiness. And I'm getting back those petroleum aspects of the pericrasol. And that oiliness of the castoreum. Isobutylquinoline doesn't have any of those facets. It's not like you added more oily waxy, so you smell more oily waxy. But they're communicating those materials. Okay, next, step 8, we're adding the Styrax. So the Styrax has that styrene note up top. But it also adds a kind of gummy, gunky feeling. Right? Motor oil is so viscous. But it's also kind of sweet. So the sweetness here, right, with the methyl laetone, and keep in mind that they, they sort of have, they're forming our little kind of sweet business. So if you're reducing methyl laetone, you can also, you look at reducing Styrax or reducing methyl laetone, but then maybe there's a hole, so you maybe need to increase the Styrax to get the right volume, but just, hitting a little differently. So now I'm smelling all of the things at the same time. It feels kind of harmonized. while maintaining a very aggressive, scratchy, oily, dusty funkiness. And then finally, the rose oxide in our last step. My nose is blown out. I can barely smell. That's right. That's going to give us a pop. Metallic. This has that green metallic sort of a relationship between this and the isobutylquinoline. And that's maybe another area I would work on. Maybe one or both of those needs to come back a little bit. Keep in mind, though, that those two materials are giving us a lot of power, right? And that effect of like hitting you in the face was important for the motor oil, because otherwise stuff can hit kind of low. So we can compare that to the strip we dipped a little while ago. So I see that paracrazole coming out really strongly right now. In the old one, in the drier one. So as I go back to my target, right, all the pieces are there. The smells are right, but they're disjointed. They're disconnected. They're not staying together to give a single impression. So if you guys are going to keep working this, what would you do?
Well, definitely the sweetness hits on the first, and that it's like a kind of derails to me that way that you talk about that intensity of the petroleum aspect of motor oil. But then it goes away. And so I don't know, I do like the rose oxide with that kind of blood-like metallic.
Mm.
I mean, maybe it's motor oil in context, you know, like the car shop.
Yeah.
Like the more metal. So yeah, but I do feel like the sweetness overwhelms the first part of it, though it's beautiful. It just doesn't scream motor oil. So yeah, maybe the reduction of the lactonic creaminess, you know, of
Yeah.
that. A creamy sweetness is nice, but then it's amazing because there's only the Stirax, the rose oxide, and the methylatone that are like on that other register. Everything else is so like in that, you know, in that oily petroleum thing. So, I mean, looking at it, it's like the Stirax and the rose oxide are at 1%. Methylatone, I mean, that's already 10% down to 10%, but 10% down to 10%, whatever that's. But yeah, it's like three materials are so strong, and then everything else are really strong materials, but they get overwhelmed.
Yeah. So yeah, I always think for me, better to reduce before you do anything else. That's always a good play, right? You may find that when you reduce, you've lost the position it was holding that was good, along with the position it was holding that was sticking out, right? So then it's like, okay, well, maybe this isn't quite the right material. You know, maybe instead of methylatone, maybe I should use, Bectanol or Sandalore that doesn't have the coconutty tone, but will give creaminess. But maybe those sit too low, right? And you don't get it up top enough. So then it's like, maybe it's a combination of a lot less methylatone and something else. So you have to watch it sort of dance around. But yeah, always reducing first before adding. Sometimes though, so Eva, you said that it smells really sweet at first, but then it goes away. So it's like, if it's perfect for you, if the sweetness is perfect, 10, 30 minutes in, whatever, and it's just the very top note where it seems too strong, maybe another idea is to play around with increasing the top note, not necessarily just the rose oxide, but other things that will kind of not cover, but bend the sweetness in a direction that makes more sense for that initial impression. You're never going to cover, but I am a big fan of leaning into something, right? So this happens a lot if you have like a base, like a soap base or something that has its own odor that's funky. Like I had one that a client wanted me to work with, but it smelled like tortilla chips, which in and of itself isn't a bad smell, but it doesn't go with everything, you know? So it was like, oh, well, but we could go like nutty, milky as a base, as opposed to like sheer ambery, because sheer ambery on tortilla chip is, I don't know, maybe, well, I don't know, maybe that just feels salty, but it still smells like a tortilla chip. So anyway, things like that. But leaning into the material and being like, okay, what is the profile of this? And can I nudge it this way so that we actually perceive it in enough of a different sphere?
I have a question about the methyl lactone. In terms of diluting, I'm wondering if I diluted it incorrectly because it's at 10 dpg and the bottle I got from Perfumer's Apprentice already said 10% on it. Was I supposed to dilute it even more to 10%? Oh,
Yes. So, oh, well, so yours is very, very, very methylated.
oh, yeah. That's where I got confused. And then also on the then Braunus, that one, the Ambrosanite 10 TEC. I have crystals and I just diluted the crystals to 1%. Was that not right either?
So you're missing a dilution strength for both. So when I write a formula, when the material comes to me already diluted, I consider that a pure material, right? That's how it's coming from the manufacturer. So in the case of methylated DPG, I take this and make a 10% dilution of it. If we had pure methylated, what we would be working with would actually be a 1% concentration. So this applies to Ambrosanide 10. It came to me diluted 10%, and I diluted that down to 1%. So if you're working from the pure crystals, you need to make a 0.1% concentration.
Yeah, I had emailed you guys about that and asked about that, and they just said to dilute the crystals. So, because I didn't understand. That's what I thought, that I needed to dilute it even more.
Very understandable. I'm sorry that actually question didn't get bounced over to me for clarification, but now you know. When it's written here, that's the thing. And then this is the concentration that you do to that thing. I never do the math in my head, right?
Okay, so the Perfumer's
So I would never say methylate.
The Perfumer's Apprentice bottle has 10% on it. So you're saying to dilute it that in itself to 10%.
Yes.
Okay, so mine's really off.
Yeah, very interesting. But yeah, so if it's written here under the material name, if the dilution is included, that's considered my raw material.
Okay.
Right? Pure, but that's the material. And then, so I stock both Ambrosanide 10 and Ambrosanide crystals. So it's really important which material I write here. You can substitute one for the other, but you would have to dilute the crystals down another dilution strength, right? Because it's already been diluted 10%. Okay. So a very understandable confusion. Thank you for sharing that question, because I am positive you're not the only person who wasn't sure about that.
Yeah, okay.
I do teach Perfume 202 and 303. which is a lot of technical stuff. And I do get into naming how I write formulas, things like that. So if you're looking for more clarity, also on lab practices and things like that, I definitely recommend that class.
I'd like to take it, but I'm going to be away visiting family during that time, so I can't unfortunately take it. But
You can always sign up just for video only. You don't have to
good
attend.
idea.
Yeah, and you'll still have a time frame to watch it in. You know, you don't have unlimited time. It's a week or two, but it is always an option if you can't attend live.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'll have to remake it. I'll see what it then really smells like.
It still needs work.
It does, but this needs a lot of work. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. Noah, you commented, tied in with the sweetness, I get a little bit of tart fruitiness from the Styrax that could probably be countered with something a little more soily. I love that. Thoughts on materials that have that soily, what kind of soil and what would you use to sort of get in there?
I mean, in motor oil, I don't really smell like a humus kind of quality. It doesn't seem like that geosmin or humus ether would be right, because that's so alive. Motor oil is so long dead. So I don't know with earthy, like, but I feel like ashy might be,
Mm,
you know, like there's something so dead.
yeah,
Doesn't have any like compost, you know,
yeah,
to me. Although it has been a long time I smelled motor oil like straight, but you know, the memory of the shop, like the
totally.
shop. So I don't know, like what's that
And
like?
so these kinds of thought processes, you know, are how you kind of, you know, guide your path. Sometimes adding something very alive highlights the deadness. So for me, indole in white floral, it's like indole smells like, you know, dead and rotty, but it makes the flower smell really alive. So always interesting, Noah. Oh yeah, so there's long dead, so dried out desert dirt. Yeah, so finding materials that talk about that, and maybe it's not a single material, you know, maybe it's something that's very sandy, dry, along with, you know, whatever else you think that earth smells like. And that's where getting to know your individual materials is so helpful. It's everything, you know, it's how you know where to begin. And of course, you could think about, you know, getting this situated. Sometimes it just needs more materials to bridge gaps, you know. That's never the first play, right? Making it more complicated because like, there's some perfumers who just, you know, they end up with 300 line formulas. And I'm like, I've smelled the results and sometimes it's absolutely beautiful. As a creator, I'm like, how do you even know what's doing what in there? You know, but like I'm kind of controlling. So it's not my way. Other people, I try to allow room for like, oh, because I like it. And, you know, who knows, let's try and see. But, you know, just continuing to go totally Baroque on it just doesn't make sense to my brain. So that's not something I do. But yeah, here sometimes you just might need to expand and add more subtle facets to kind of tie it all in. And of course, I don't know, where's the motor oil? Is it used motor oil on the floor of a garage? You know, like, do you want to talk about the cars? And is it an old garage with rusted out, you know, Cadillacs? Is it, you know, a weird American Psycho, you know, Lamborghini garage that's super spotlessly clean and has a single drop of oil on the floor? You know, like, I don't know, what are you talking about? You're talking about, you know, the motor oil on a mechanic's hands, all kinds of good stuff. So that was a lot. Thank you guys for hanging in. I hope this gives you some ideas on, you know, how you might approach whatever project it is that you're curious about. there's really no right or wrong way. It's a lot about, I ask myself a lot of questions, right? That's sort of how I do it, like ask and answer questions. And then, the visceral stuff. How does it feel? How does it feel physically? How does it feel emotionally? All of that. You have to bring a lot of yourself and a lot of presence to this work, I think. If you stay very intellectual only, you can really miss the mark. I love that it kind of requires very complete effort of our capabilities, our mind and hearts and bodies. Any last thoughts, questions? No, it's a quiet group today. Thank you guys so much for joining. And I hope I'll see you soon. If you ever have questions, you can reach out, Ashley@ardentolfaction.com. I can't answer massive lists of questions, but if you ever just have, something quick, happy to stay in touch with you guys. All right, take good care. Go rest your noses.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.